Her silence doesn't hurt because she left. It hurts because it forces the man to sit with the echo of his own emptiness. And if that already feels uncomfortably close, don't look away, because what follows may change how you see love forever. In the mythology of human longing, nothing binds tighter than the spell of the divine feminine. She is not a person, but an archetype, a mirror, shimmering, untouchable, carrying both the promise of wholeness and the threat of despair. To the man who gazes too long, she becomes both savior and captor. But here lies the first fracture. When the archetype is mistaken for the woman herself, the relationship slips into a parasocial prison. He does not love her. He loves the projection of his own soul cast upon her form. And she, unknowingly, becomes the hostage of his unmet needs. Have you noticed how silence grows louder the longer you wait for an answer? What begins as quiet expectation soon mutates into obsession. The first warning sign is subtle yet devastating: idealization. The man places her upon a pedestal carved from his own hunger. He sees not the woman but a goddess, flawless, eternal, beyond human frailty. And yet, the higher he lifts her, the further she drifts from reach. Every text left unread, every pause in conversation, every silence between words becomes unbearable, because what he worships is not her presence, but her absence. An absence, like a vacuum, pulls at the raw edges of his psyche. Alan Watts once whispered, "The more you grasp, the less you hold." Isn't it strange, then, that the more desperately he clings to her image, the faster it slips through his fingers? The second warning sign emerges in the quiet ache of unreciprocated investment. He pours time, energy, and devotion into the altar of her image. But what returns is not affection, only silence, not rejection, not cruelty, not even dismissal, just silence. And silence, when filtered through the wound of longing, becomes unbearable noise. The man waits, refreshes the screen, imagines scenarios, builds castles of fantasy from every crumb of interaction. And have you ever noticed how a single emoji, a delayed reply, or a sudden disappearance can feel heavier than any spoken rejection? Here, the parasocial prison tightens, because it is not built of chains, but of imagination, not imposed by her, but by him. She does not even need to close the door. He locks it from the inside. The third warning sign arises in the shadow of dependency. Her attention becomes oxygen. Without it, he suffocates. Her gaze becomes water. Without it, he thirsts. The tragedy is not that she withholds, but that he cannot breathe without her. Every moment apart feels like exile from life itself. Every unanswered silence feels like death in miniature. And isn't it haunting that what starves him most is not her cruelty, but her neutrality? She owes him nothing, yet he feels entitled to everything. This is where the prison bars reveal their shape. The divine feminine, once a symbol of wholeness, has become a cage of projection. The woman herself is no longer seen. She has been replaced by an ideal he cannot let go of. But what happens when the goddess descends, when the illusion cracks, when the silence becomes too heavy to ignore? Because here lies the cruel paradox. The very silence that wounds him is also the silence that could free him, but only if he dares to listen. The man is now standing at the threshold. He is faced with a choice: to continue feeding the illusion or to step into the shadow where the truth awaits. But silence has another secret, one most men never survive. Silence is not empty. It is full of every echo you've tried to bury. And when the woman does not answer, the man discovers that it is not her voice he longs for, but the absence of his own. The fourth warning sign is projection of shadow wounds. What she withholds becomes the screen upon which his unresolved traumas are played. Her unread message stirs the memory of a mother who never saw him. Her delay awakens the echo of a father who was absent. Her quietness becomes the voice of every betrayal, every rejection, every childhood wound left untended. And isn't it strange how one woman's silence can resurrect a lifetime of ghosts? The parasocial prison deepens here because the man does not see her. He sees himself fragmented, abandoned, unworthy, yet he calls it love. The fifth warning sign, fusion with fantasy. Reality no longer satisfies because reality contains risk. But fantasy is flawless. In fantasy, she never leaves, never falters, never denies him. And so he chooses the prison willingly. The divine feminine he worships is not the woman who breathes, but the image he polishes in his imagination. Every glance becomes exaggerated. Every gesture becomes prophecy. Every silence becomes sacred text. But what is more suffocating than to confuse worship with love, to long not for a person, but for an archetype that no person could ever embody? Here, the man begins to fragment. His days revolve around her presence, his nights around her absence. The prison bars are made not of steel, but of narrative. Every thought returns to her. Every silence replays. Every possibility twists into obsession. Have you ever noticed how the mind, when deprived of answers, invents them? And how the answers it invents always cut deeper than the truth could? Alan Watts once reflected, trying to define yourself is like trying to bite your own teeth. And yet this is exactly what the man does. He tries to define himself through her silence, through her absence, through her imagined gaze. But her gaze is not salvation. It is a mirror. And what he sees staring back is the shadow he has spent years avoiding. The descent is not gentle. The parasocial prison does not merely confine. It corrodes. Every moment waiting for her response is a silent agreement with self-erasure. Every unanswered call is a pact with despair. The woman becomes both tormentor and healer, though she has done nothing but exist. Isn't it haunting that she does not need to act at all? Her silence is enough to unravel him. This is the nature of shadow work. It reveals the wound behind the wound. The obsession with her is not about her at all. It is about the self he abandoned long ago, the inner child who never felt seen, the fractured man who never felt worthy, the lover who confuses attention with oxygen. And yet when faced with this truth, most men turn away, because to see the wound clearly is to risk losing the illusion that sustains them. But illusions are hungry gods. They demand sacrifice. And the sacrifice, more often than not, is the man's sovereignty. Have you ever felt yourself giving away pieces of your soul to someone who never asked for them? And when you noticed, was it already too late? The parasocial prison thrives on repetition. The cycle spins endlessly. Hope, silence, projection, despair. Hope, silence, projection, despair. Each round tighter than the last. Each silence heavier than before. Until one day, the man forgets what his own voice sounds like without her name attached to it. Alan Watts would remind us, muddy water is best cleared by leaving it alone. But the man does not leave it alone. He stirs the mud, clings to the murk, and calls it devotion. The descent into shadow is merciless because it strips away excuses. The man can no longer pretend he is simply in love. No, he is ensnared, not by her, but by the version of himself that he has chained to her silence. And this is the point of greatest danger, where the prison begins to feel like home. But storms carry more than destruction. They also carry the possibility of light breaking through. And beyond the storm lies a moment of reckoning, the turning point where the illusion begins to collapse. The question is, will he survive the breaking or be consumed by it? The storm cannot last forever. Every obsession has its breaking point. And when the silence stretches too far, when the fantasy no longer holds, something begins to fracture inside the man. It is not she who breaks him. It is his own illusion collapsing under its own weight. The prison is revealed for what it truly is, self-made. The walls are painted with projection, the locks forged from insecurity, the bars sculpted from longing. She never built it, he did. Have you noticed how illusions demand more and more energy to sustain until at last the exhaustion becomes unbearable? This exhaustion is mercy in disguise, for in his weariness the man can no longer pretend. He sees the truth shimmering through the cracks. She is not a goddess, not a mirror, not a savior. She is simply a woman, flesh, bone, imperfect, alive. And in that realization, the chains rattle. The turning point is not dramatic. It is quiet, almost anticlimactic, a whisper rather than a roar. The man recognizes that his suffering is not her silence, but his attachment to what that silence represents. He suffers not because she ignores him, but because he cannot bear to ignore himself. Alan Watts spoke often of ego death, the shattering of the false self we build to avoid the rawness of existence. And here, ego death comes dressed as heartbreak. The illusion of the eternal goddess disintegrates, leaving the man staring into the mirror of his own vulnerability. Isn't it haunting how the most painful moments are often the very ones that free us? The man begins to see silence differently. It is not punishment, it is reflection. Every unanswered message echoes not with her rejection, but with his own voice asking, "Why am I not enough for myself?" Here, a new possibility flickers. For the first time, he considers that liberation may not come from her reply, but from his release. This is the essence of individuation, Carl Jung's great map of the soul: to withdraw projection, to reclaim the shadow, to see the other not as savior or destroyer, but simply as themselves, no more, no less. But the process is not smooth. Each attempt at detachment feels like tearing away flesh. Each step toward wholeness feels like betrayal of the fantasy that once sustained him. Have you felt that, the strange grief of losing not a person, but a dream? The man grieves the goddess who never existed. He grieves the love story he wrote alone. He grieves the part of himself that clung so desperately to silence, mistaking it for intimacy. This grief is sacred because only through it can rebirth occur. Alan Watts would remind us, you are an aperture through which the universe is looking at itself. And in this aperture, the man begins to understand. The divine feminine he worshipped was never outside. It was a fragment of his own soul, exiled, projected, and disguised as another. Isn't it strange that the love we chase in others is often the love we refuse to grant ourselves? This recognition does not erase the pain, but it transforms it. What once felt like rejection now feels like redirection. What once felt like loss now feels like revelation. The prison door creaks, not because she unlocked it, but because he finally realized it was never locked at all. Here lies the paradox of awakening. The man does not need her silence to end. He needs only to end the meaning he attached to it. And in doing so, he begins to taste something rare, freedom. And in doing so, he begins to taste something rare, freedom. The test is not whether she will answer, but whether he will. This is the moment of choice, to cling to illusion or to surrender to reality, to remain prisoner or to step into the unknown. And isn't the unknown always more terrifying and yet more liberating than any fantasy? The man stands at the edge of himself, staring into the possibility of rebirth. But rebirth always asks for one final sacrifice, the death of the dream. And that is the threshold he now approaches, trembling, uncertain, but ready. Rebirth does not arrive like thunder. It comes softly, almost unnoticed, like the first light spilling over a horizon you thought would remain dark forever. The man begins to understand The silence he once feared was never an enemy. It was a teacher. It revealed the hollowness of his projections, the fragility of his ego, the shadow he had abandoned. And now, freed from the parasocial prison, he begins to hear something he had long silenced, his own soul. Have you noticed how the world itself feels different once the obsession lifts, as if colors return that you forgot existed? Here lies the essence of liberation, detachment, not coldness, not indifference, but the soft recognition that the woman is not a goddess, not a captor, not a savior, simply a human being. She is free to stay, free to leave, free to remain silent, and he, finally, is free regardless. Alan Watts would often remind us that clinging is the root of suffering. The man now sees what this means. Love, in its truest form, cannot be chained. It flows or it fades, and both are sacred. Isn't it beautiful that the very silence which once tormented him is now the silence through which he meets himself? Individuation blossoms here. The projection collapses, and the divine feminine is no longer trapped in one woman's body. She reemerges within his psyche as inspiration, as creativity, as the inner muse that whispers life back into his spirit. He sees that she was never lost, only misplaced, and in finding her within, he no longer needs to imprison her without. This is not the death of longing. It is the birth of true longing, not for possession, but for presence, not for escape, but for depth, not for fantasy, but for reality. The man learns that love is not about filling emptiness, but about meeting fullness with fullness. The parasocial prison collapses because he no longer seeks oxygen from another's breath. He breathes on his own. And have you felt the quiet relief of realizing you no longer need what once enslaved you? Here the soul softens. The silence no longer echoes with absence. It hums with presence. It becomes spacious, not suffocating. What was once unbearable is now the very ground of peace. Alan Watts once whispered, "To have faith is to trust yourself to the water." When you swim, you don't grab hold of the water, because if you do, you will sink and drown. Instead, you relax and float. This is the floating. This is the trust. The man no longer grabs, he allows, and in allowing, he discovers freedom. The woman remains who she always was, free, human, fallible. Her silence no longer defines him. Her presence no longer enslaves him. He can love without worship. He can see without projecting. He can hold without clinging. Isn't it strange that what once felt like loss now feels like liberation? This is the final paradox. The divine feminine was never outside. She was the part of his soul he had abandoned, waiting patiently in the silence until he was ready to return. And in her silence, he finally hears it, the sound of his own soul coming home.